federal budget and playing with that in terms of proportions and a little bit of per capita. So we're going to play with the 2012 federal budget with receipts meaning income, money that we received of $2.45 trillion, and then expenses or money going out of $3.54 trillion. So in number one, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate the difference between receipts and expenses for 2012. Now, it's easy to see that they're both in trillions, so we can kind of ignore the label and just add it to the end. So receipts are more. So 3.54 minus 2.45 is 1.09. Add the label of trillion. Now, because the expenses are more, we paid more than we took in, so that makes this a deficit. All right, so we have a $1.09 trillion deficit, and that is what we are going to use throughout this page. Number two, if the average citizen with a per capita income of $42,693 operated like the federal government, what would be the expenses for that citizen? Okay, so now we're thinking citizen versus the government, and we're talking income to expenses. Okay, well, for the citizen, they have an income, they say of $42,693, and we're trying to figure out the expenses for that citizen. Well, the government has income of $2.45 trillion and expenses of $3.54 trillion. Now, again, since both of those governmental numbers are in trillions, we don't have to put them on there. They can just be, because they would cancel out. So we go to solve this just like a normal proportion. 2.45x equals, go the other way, 15113.22. Recall that we divide both sides by 2.45. We divide by the number in front of x, and that will leave us with a per capita deficit of that's not correct. $61,687.03 for a citizen. If you operated like the government, you would spend almost $62,000 a year when you only bring in $42,000 a year. So you would spend roughly $20,000 more than you brought in if you acted like the government. Right? I rounded there to talk there. Okay. Now, and number three, let's assume the U.S. population in 2012 was 314 million people. Let's calculate the per capita deficit. Okay, so that means we want the deficit per capita. Okay, well, we know that the deficit is 1.09 trillion, and trillion is times 10 to the 12th. Well, we have 314 million. Million is times 10 to the 6th. Well, if you think about scientific notation, 1, 2, it's bigger, so I would add 2. So this is the same as 1.09 times 10 to the 12th divided by 3.14 times 10 to the 8th. Because I moved it 2 places, so that went up by 2. Now, when I divide, I get 0.34734, I rounded, times 10 to the 12 minus 8 is 4. Putting that into standard form, I move my decimal 4 places to the right. So $3,471.34. So in 2012, if everybody who was making, everybody was making an average of $42,693, if they would have all taken $3,471.34, given that to the government, we could have erased our deficit. Now, that includes everybody. That's every person in prison, that's every homeless person, that's every child, that's everybody. So if you have 4 kids, you would pay for that for you, your spouse, if you have a spouse, and then that amount for each kid. That's per person, not just people who are making the money, but per person. Okay? All right, that's kind of depressing. Now, we're going to do some comparison of numbers of how big is a trillion, because we talk about having $1 trillion deficit. So we're going to kind of set up this proportion, and it starts by saying 1 trillion is to 10,000. Well, a trillion is 1 times 10 to the 12th, and 10,000 is 1 times 10 to the 4th. So 1 trillion is to 10,000 as 1 million, that's 1 times 10 to the 6th, is to what? Now, I'm not going to use x because we have x. I'm going to use, let's use m. Okay, as to what? So we're going to find what compares to a million as 10,000 compares to a trillion. Because I think $10,000 is a lot of money. So let's figure this out. If we cross multiply, I have 1 times 10 to the 12th times my value of m, and that equals, I go the other way, multiply 1 times 10 to the 4 plus 6 is 10. Now recall in solving proportions that we're going to divide by the number in front of the variable, which in this case is 1 times 10 to the 12th. So the value would be divide, we have 1 times 10 to the 10 minus 12 is negative 2. Well, if you move your decimal 2 places over, you get 0.01. That's a penny. So $10,000 to a trillion is the same as a penny to a million. That's the comparison. So when the federal government says, you know, the federal government, they have $1 trillion deficit, they're going to cut it by $1 billion. That's like if you have $10,000 in credit card debt saying, okay, I'll cut that by a penny. That's the same. So it's very, very small, right? 1 million compared to $1 trillion is like a penny compared to 10,000. Very different. Okay, how much money would the U.S. government have to save to be comparable to a savings of $100 to the average citizen with a per capita income of $42,693? So we're saying if you have, we're comparing income to savings. And again, we're comparing the citizen compared to the government. So this citizen has an income of that's not a 2. Goodness gracious. $42,693, and they're saving $100. Now, the income of the government, the income, remember, they receive $2.45 trillion. How much will they have to save? And I'm going to go ahead and just say my answer for right now is going to be in trillion. I'll play with it in a second. So when I cross multiply, I get 42,693x equals 245. I divide both sides by 42,693. And I get an answer of x equals 0.00574, and that's trillion. Now, remember that our millions, billions, trillions, they go in groups of 3. So 0.005, that's a small amount of trillion. If we move it to the right 3, we're going to change it to billion. So 1, 2, 3. This is the same as 5.74 billion. Okay, what that means is if you are a person who brings in about $42,693 a year and you save $100, for the government who brings in $2.45 trillion to be comparable, they would have to save $5.74 billion. That's the comparison. So you can just see how big the debt is and how big the numbers in terms of money that the government deals with. All right, the second part of this video just kind of plays with this graph, and you'll see on the left that we have the debt and surplus. So here is the break-even line. Anything below it is a deficit. Anything above it is a surplus, right? We had extra money. And then on the right, the debt accumulation. So every year if we have more debt, right, it accumulates. So it just gets bigger. And these values, just for the note, are in billions. So number 1, according to the chart on the left, around what year was there a surplus? Well, surplus is when it's above. So that corresponds to right around the year. So right around the year 2000. Okay, so there was a surplus in 2000. Now, how is it reflected in the accumulated deficit chart on the right? So if we go to the chart on the right, here's 2000. If you look above, that's kind of where it flatlined, right? Let me erase that so you can see it. But you can see that around 2000 is where the accumulation flatlined. So you can say, it flatlined, meaning there was no more accumulation. It wasn't continuing to get bigger. It kind of evened out. What's been happening in recent years according to the chart on the left? And then we'll look at number 4 at the same time. Estimate the accumulated deficit and debt, put those together for 2015. Well, recently, this says recently, you can see how before that was kind of the biggest. we've really accumulated a lot of debt recently, and you can see how quickly it's then escalated. So when you look at 2015, we're at approximately 18,000 billion. And I want to play with that in terms of 18,000 billion. Because billion, don't forget, means 9. So 18,000, add 9 more zeros, and I now have 3, 6, 9, 12 zeros, so this is like 18 trillion. So it's estimated, based off this chart, that in 2015 we had roughly $18 trillion in debt. Gross.